Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Digging Deeper, Sutton Hoo and Anglo-Saxon England. The 17th century burial found at Sutton Hoo, England, recently the topic of a new film, still captivates us. In addition to this site, in recent years, there have been a surprising number of new discoveries, including the Prittlewell Prince and the Staffordshire Hoard, each offering fresh insights into this period of history in England. What are the experts learning about these centuries that used to be relegated to the term the Dark Ages? The objects of gleaming gold, garnets, and silver tell us that this period was marked by more sophistication, trade, and culture than previously thought. And we can observe the expansion of Christianity among the artifacts being uncovered. We're going to explore the famous Sutton Hoo Ship Burial in more detail and learn about the new discoveries being made in the last 2 decades. So this presentation is led by art historian Mary Woodward, who serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as public programs coordinator, educator at the Concord Museum. She has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. And she has more than 40 years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of James K. Polk, former president. So again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring, and all 85 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for joining us this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. And thank you to the Friends of Tewksbury Library for your support. And thank you all for joining us today. For Digging Deeper, Sutton Hoo and Anglo-Saxon England, and perhaps a second subtitle could be Not the Dark Ages. I hope to convince you of that. While often seen as merely an interlude between the fall of Roman Britain in 410 and the beginning of medieval England in 1066, the Anglo-Saxon period was a time of great change and innovation. It lasted around 650 years, longer than either of the preceding or following chapters of English history. What began as a period of tribal family groups landing on Britain's shores ended in a single unified country of Anglo-Saxon England, with towns, with foreign and domestic trade, with systems of taxation, with the formalized worship and the spread of Christianity, a stratified society with royalty at the top, including some very powerful women. So what do we know already? Well, there are aspects of Anglo-Saxon England that are with us every day. The most obvious is the language we speak. English is derived from the language that they spoke, Old English. And the country took its name from them. Angle or Angulus becomes England. We count among the world's greatest art treasures, illuminated manuscripts that were created by monks during this period. The Lindisfarne Gospels there on the left and the Book of Kells display the same kind of geometric shapes and animal interlace and plant foliage, sharing those same motifs and designs with the splendid gold and garnet objects, which you'll see created during the same time. In literature alone, this was a stunning time. This was when Beowulf, the epic poem about the Scandinavian prince, was written, becoming a hallmark of English literature. And believe it or not, we have a history of the period written during the period we're talking about by the famous monk, the Venerable Bede. And you see a page of that on the right. It was a time of some familiar names in history of Christianity as it expanded throughout Britain. St. Patrick was born in England during these years in about 385 and died in Ireland in the 460s. In the following century, we saw St. Columba on the island of Iona. And in 597, St. Augustine arrived in Canterbury. So it was a very dynamic time. Here are a couple of views of the handful of mostly Anglo-Saxon churches that still remain. In other words, most of their content inside, most of the buildings still considered Anglo-Saxon. There are several that remain, and you'll see two more here, including the one on the right, the Church of St. Andrew, which is considered the oldest wooden church in the world. And even though it's in England, it looks very much like it would have come straight from Scandinavia, and no doubt the ideas behind it did. We've all heard in our general knowledge of things, the legend of King Arthur, right? But there was a real king who united Anglo-Saxon England. King Alfred, the only English king to ever be called the Great. He's credited with saving the country from being completely taken over by Vikings and with making peace with them. Alfred reestablished learning in his empire, even translating some important books himself. The Alfred jewel, which you see there, is about a 2-inch beautiful gold and enamel piece, which used to sit at the end of a pointer. And Alfred had these made and given out to friends of his, along with the translations of the books he was working on. Just by the way, and some of you may know this if you're from New York State, Alfred University in New York State has King Alfred as their mascot, and the town uses the telephone exchange of 871. Why? Because that's the year King Alfred took the throne in Wessex. So my point is that things that happened eons ago really could affect our lives today. So in the beginning, let's have a quick run through of English history and see what we're looking at. Here's a map with showing that the Romans conquered Britain in 43 AD and developed a Romanized society out of the native Britons. Of course, not everyone went along with that. The Celts were famously on the fringe and always troublesome. The Picts were up in Scotland. The Scots were over in Ireland. They weren't on board either. But it was all worth it for the resources that the Romans gained for their empire. Salt, lead, and grain were the main exports from Britain. Then, after almost 400 years, it was too much for the Roman forces stretched across so vast a territory. And the fall of Roman Britain began with troop projections in the 380s, and it continued into the 410. And even though the impact wasn't immediately felt everywhere, there was still some sort of Romanized society that hung on for generations. But you can see from this map how the country was being kind of invaded from every corner. Well, what happened next after the Romans packed up and left? It's generally believed that about 20 or 30 years later, a British leader named Vortigern brought in Angles and Jutes and Saxons as mercenaries in order to help fight against the Scots and the Picts in exchange for land and money. In the archaeological record, we see this change from about the 430s onward, where the archaeologists find remains of evidence of people who are obviously from Scandinavia and from Germany. We have all of this in the writing from that very trusted source, the Venerable Bede. He was a monk up in Northumbria, and you see that in the upper part of the map there. His book was called The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, and it was written in the year 731. Bede becomes the first author to use the very now familiar system of dating by Christ's birth, BC and AD. Well, as mercenaries sometimes do, they revolted within a couple of decades. The Britons beat them back with the help of a very powerful leader named Ambrosius Aurelius in a battle in the 490s. And I mention this because some scholars believe that's the legend of King Arthur. By the late 600s, though, Anglo-Saxons, those were the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons, were in control of 2/3 of the country, all the pink parts of that map, with 7 kingdoms to the that we would recognize the names of today, and you see them listed there. Northumbria being way up there north of the Humber River. Each of the kingdoms had a king, each of these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but they began, as things developed, to consider one of them their leader, and they called him the Bretwalda, the king over kings. It wasn't a hereditary position like we think of royalty today, so it must have been, scholars think, something that the kings agreed on. The fourth man to hold that position in the history of Anglo-Saxon England was a fellow named Redwald, the king of East Anglia. And that brings us to Sutton Hoo. I hope some of you were able to watch the recent film called The Dig about the discovery of Sutton Hoo. If so, this will be familiar to you, and if not, I hope it can serve as an introduction for you. Simply said, the discovery of Sutton Hoo revolutionized the way people understand Anglo-Saxon England, as it was so-called formerly the Dark Ages. In 1938, Edith Pretty was a widow with an 8-year-old son living in a large house, and you may see it there to the right in the middle of the screen, or on the right edge of the screen, set in 400 acres of land with mounds, earthen mounds that had attracted her attention and actually led her to buy the property in the first place. She had grown up with an interest and involvement in archaeology herself. She needed a professional archaeologist, and she contacted the nearby museum. They recommended a local man to be her excavator, Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist and astronomer. He knew the land well, having worked closely in it for years. His work it was at Sutton Hoo has been described as sensitive and careful, and yet for years his name was lost to the public. Happily, I can tell you his name now appears in the labels where these objects are displayed at the British Museum. The first mound he dug a trench into was Mound 3, and I've put a black arrow there on the left. And he found a wooden tray holding some cremated bone, an axe head, but little else, reaching the conclusion that grave robbers, had been there before them. So then Brown moved on to Mound 2 with the black arrow on the right side. He oriented his trench east-west because that's roughly the direction he had done in Mound 3. His hunch was a good one. Right away, he found pieces of iron. In a stroke of genius, he recognized what they were: rivets from a ship. They looked like bolts just a few inches long with somewhat flattened heads on either end. They were used, or have been used, to secure the strakes or the wooden sides of a ship. There were a few minor artifacts that he found in the mound, but robbers had been there too. The wooden part of the boat had disintegrated in the soil after more than 1,300 years, but the iron rivets remained. And clearly, as the drawing in the scatter pattern shows you, the robbers cared nothing at all about the iron rivets. They just walked over them and scattered them as they stole things out of the trench. And the little dots all over the plan there on the left, all those little dots scattered left and right, are where they found the iron rivets. Brown moved on to mound number 4 and discovered it had also been robbed. But again, he found cremated bones along with some fragments of textiles and bronze. And he correctly theorized what that meant, that an Anglo-Saxon body had been cremated, wrapped in cloth, and placed in a bronze bowl that was then buried within a mound. So he understood that he was digging into burial mounds. And then that was it. The first season of digging had ended with a few finds and the realization that the mounds had been dug into by robbers in the past. Basil Brown kept very careful notes. He was sure that these remains were Anglo-Saxon, and he knew that at least one mound, this one Mound 2, had once held a ship inside. The trenches were filled back at the end of that first season with one modern addition. Robert Pretty, age 8, let his steel roller skates get reburied into Mound 2. The next season began in May of 1939. According to Brown's diary entry, he wrote this. He says, "I asked Mrs. Pretty which one she would like opened, and she pointed to Mound 1 and asked, 'What about this?' So that's how we began, with the help of 2 other estate workers, the gardener and the gamekeeper." One researcher has subsequently written, "So simply and almost casually was the decision made, which led to the dramatic finding of the unique treasure ship of Sutton Hoo." They began in the same fashion as he had the year before, with a 4-foot wide trench on an east-west access into the mound. Then 3 days later, the first find. The gardener held up a piece of iron, and it was a ship's rivet. This was followed by 5 more, and Basil Brown realized that they were at the end of one ship, and the end of a ship, and they needed to carry on their excavating very carefully from there in order to preserve the rivets in place. So if you look at this photograph, all of those little dots with shadows behind them are the actual iron rivets still sitting in their original place. The wood of the ship has disintegrated, but the sand held the form of the beads and the wooden sides, and the sand was compact enough to hold the rivets in the long rows that they had originally been in when they were part of the boat. In Brown's words, from now on, extreme care had to be practiced, and the ship's interior was gradually cleaned, frame by frame, with bare hands and small tools like the kitchen dustpan. Well, news of the discovery reached the British Museum, who sent Charles Phillips, an archaeologist from Cambridge, to the site. He convinced Mrs. Pretty that a more professional dig needed to take place, and he instructed Brown to stop his dig. As one author notes, never greatly in awe of authority, Basil Brown took little notice of the injunction that had been put upon him and continued to excavate without pause for nearly 4 weeks. Well, it turns out that this was beneficial in a number of ways. Not the least was that it meant that someone was there protecting the site from onlookers. By July 3rd, he had uncovered almost the entire ship. By the 3rd week of July 1939, the same year they started, a spectacular gold and garnet treasures began to emerge with the help of the archaeologists brought in by Phillips. The first things were 2 tiny gold and garnet pyramids. These are less than an inch in diameter. That's just an amazing photo the British Museum has, but less than an inch, judged to be the decoration of a sword strap. The very next day, gold object after gold object was revealed in Mound 1, including the shoulder clasps, the great hollow buckle, and the purse lid. The gold pieces looked as shiny as the day they'd been made 1,300 years earlier. The young archaeologists, who you see here, used a variety of unusual tools on the dig. The long-handled fireplace shovel, which you see at the bottom of this photo, made a perfect tool for lifting flat, horizontal sections of sand off the ship body. Then they continued with the pastry brush, pen knives, and Mrs. Pretty's fireplace bellows to gently blow the sand and earth off of things. If you saw the film, they did exactly what was depicted there. They put the objects in boxes of gathered moss and to cushion them and to keep them from drying out too quickly. They worked 17 days on Mound 1, uncovering 263 objects, but no body. That could mean a couple of things. It could mean that it was a cenotaph, a memorial to a person who was dead, but whose body was unavailable, like lost at sea. But most of those involved then and now feel confident that the bones simply decomposed in the acidic sand and left no visible trace. As to the question of who's buried here, one name came up convincingly. It must be the burial of Redwall, the Anglo-Saxon king of East Anglia who died in the year 625. According to Bede, Redwall ruled over all the provinces south of the Humber, so really that's most of England, the pink part on the map we saw. He dabbled in Christianity, but he remained pagan at his death. The coins found in the burial help date it to 625, and that added weight to the theory that this was indeed Redwall, the king of the Anglo-Saxons, buried in Mound 1. By the end of August 1939, the excavation was over and they covered up the ship with branches, but they didn't fill it in with soil. And the war between England and Germany was declared a week later. And that's where the film ends. Mrs. Pritty gave the collection to the nation, to the British Museum, and it remains the largest gift given by a living donor in their history. But the story of Sutton Hoo continues. During the war, the site was subjected to some rather unimaginable insults. Ditches were dug all over the area of East Anglia, and you can see some here in the photo, to prevent German soldiers in gliders from landing in those flat fields. And then the area became a military training camp for English soldiers, and they used the mounds for target practice with rifles and grenades and mortars. And the worst of all was that they practiced driving tracked vehicles like troop carriers and tanks up and down the mounds. Well, luckily, this came to someone's attention and it was stopped. Mrs. Edith Pritty died in 1942, and her son moved away, actually never to return to Sutton Hoo. The house and the land were sold, but the Pritty family retained the rights to excavate and ownership of any finds in perpetuity. The site was re-excavated in the 1960s and again in the 1980s. Let's look at some of the stunning treasures from Mound 1 in a little bit more detail. The famous Sutton Hoo helmet. It's made of iron and tinned bronze and gold and garnets. It was reconstructed from 300 to 400 pieces that came from the site. And the smooth sections that you see here are filling in for missing pieces. The curator of the collection at the British Museum tells us that it weighs 5.5 pounds. So it's heavy, but it would most certainly have been worn in battle. And sorry for the barking, sorry. It would not have been just a ceremonial piece. Sweetie, stop it. Sorry. Let's look at the design and the snakes. Excuse me just a second. Excuse me. Oh, I'm so sorry. I haven't had to do this before. There we go.
Don't worry about it, Mary. It happens to the best of us.
I can't. All right, let's look at the design. So not a ceremonial piece, but actually worn in battle. Let's look at this more closely with the help of Edit feature. I've drawn some things on it. So the snake's body is this ridge over the top of the helmet. The snake has two heads, one at the back and one at the front. And the snake head in the front, which I've picked out in purple there on the screen, is coming face to face with a winged creature. And you see that creature in orange. There's a beak there between the eyes, and the wings form the eyebrows. The body forms the nose piece, and the tail forms the little mustache. Honestly, I looked at this thing for dozens of years and never seen that. So I had to draw it out for everybody. As an author describes it, this is protection. This is physical and psychological protection for the wearer of the highest order. This is a helmet of the sort imagined by the Beowulf poet. It's such that no sword could harm the wearer of such a magnificent piece. The shoulder clasps of gold, garnet, and glass mosaic were probably made by a local master in East Anglia. This diagram from the British Museum there in the lower left shows the layers, how the object is built up in layers. It's the cloisonné technique. Little cells or cloisons of gold are filled with slices of garnet or glass or other material. This is exquisite work on such a tiny scale. I can tell you each of these is just the size of your open hand. It's amazing. There's the giant belt buckle, equivalent in gold to the value of 90 heads of cattle. And look at the interlace on it. As you start to pick it out, it's easier because the craftsman also used material called niello, which is a fine black paste to sort of put in the incised lines to help you pick out the size and design. It weighs nearly a pound by itself and is several inches long. And you can see from the diagram, it's full of animal interlace, birds, serpents. It's got it all going on right there. The magnificent purse lid was once attached to a piece of bone or ivory. That's why it's shown, the pieces are shown on a white background. Let's look at the imagery here. There's geometric patterning around the edges. There's animal interlace there in the center. And there are these two plaques to the lower right and left that feature a man standing, but being menaced, you could have to say, by a creature to either side with their gaping mouths on either side of his head. That can't be good, can it? Things like this appear in Anglo-Saxon culture of the time period as well. But it's magnificent. What was in this purse? Well, the archaeologists found Merovingian coins, and they mention it in the movie because it's evidence that this is not a Viking burial, but it's older than that. The Merovingians existed before the Vikings. What they found in the purse of the person buried, the man buried in Mound 1, were 37 coins, interestingly from 37 different mints, interesting, along with 5 other blanks and ingots. So that's a total of 42. And one scholar has suggested that that was exactly right because there were 40 oarsmen on the ship, plus the pilot, plus the steerman. So these were people who would be paid to symbolically row the king into the afterlife. So let's talk about the ship for a minute. Here's a beautiful artist's rendering of what we should be looking at. The Sutton Hoo ship in Mound 1 was 90 feet long, larger than any other ship they found from the early Dark Ages. The ship was placed in a long trench that had been cut as deep as 11.5 feet into the ground, and the ship was held together by probably 3,000 of those iron rivets. The burial chamber, which you see there in the middle, was about 18 feet long in the center of the ship. The grave goods and the body, he's in a red tunic there, were carefully placed inside the burial chamber, and then the whole thing was covered with soil and shaped into a large mound. But years later, maybe even centuries later, the roof collapsed, crushing the burial chamber and leaving that dizzying array of artifacts scattered. As the 1983 campaign began, they started with metal detectors, something that hadn't been as readily available in earlier years. And they came across, among things, piles of bullets and cartridge cases, which had been left behind during the military training years. They came across a pile of bottle caps left behind by the archaeologists in the 1960s. And they also had a bit of fun. They kept the grass cut short. Now that would help them in their dig, but this led to the development of a new form of golf game in their spare time. Several local variants of the sport were invented, and one of them consisted from chipping their golf ball from the top of one mound to the top of the other. And on a good day, you were meant to play them in numerical order, starting at mound 1 and ending at mound 14. Well, it might be silly, but in this way, they actually discovered 2 more mounds, numbers 17 and 18 over there on the right, when one golf ball kept rolling to the side of mound 12 inexplicably. and they discovered 2 more burials. The archaeologists reopened Mound 2 and discovered that Basil Brown hadn't gone quite deep enough. He did find part of a boat, remember the rivets, but not the whole boat. They made another stunning discovery as they dug. In this mound, the burial chamber was located completely under the boat, and I've put a black arrow there so that you can see it. This too had been a wealthy ship burial, a boat about 60 feet long, then covered with a mound of soil. The remaining mounds and the adjacent areas were somewhat excavated then, but have been left for future archaeologists after the 1980s. And as recently as this year, I can tell you that archaeologists from Britain's Time Team television show, if you don't watch that, it's loads of fun, have been working on the site with their newer technology like geophysics, like ground penetrating radar. So studying Sutton Hoo now with things that weren't available in decades past. And it's an active concern to continue to excavate Sutton Hoo. And I've put a link in the references. There are a group of shipbuilders in the area who are trying to rebuild the Mound 1 90-foot-long ship. So that should be exciting to watch as well. So we're going to leave Sutton Hoo now, and we're going to turn our attention to a few more discoveries and see what they tell us about Anglo-Saxon England. The discovery of this intact burial chamber occurred in 2003 when a road widening project was proposed, and the town of Prittlewell in Essex was required to have an archaeological survey made first. I bet they're glad they did. They found the earliest Anglo-Saxon royal burial known in England so far. The man was buried in a large chamber built below ground level, wooden floor, wooden walls, and a roof, 13 square feet in size. The original burial mound had been plowed down over the years, so there was absolutely no evidence of this on the surface. Using the most modern techniques, they began working down the interior walls, finding several items still hanging on the wall hooks where they were placed in the early 600s, in like the year 600. And you can see it in this photo. If you look to the photo on the right, I've put a black arrow showing a brass or bronze pot hanging on the wall. And there in the photo on the left is that same pot hanging on the same hook on the wall 1400 years later. As at Sutton Hoo, the body itself didn't survive in the acidic soil, but tooth enamel particles were uncovered using techniques that weren't even invented when Sutton Hoo was excavated. They found similar kinds of grave goods. They found a beautiful gold buckle like you see here, only it's not decorated, and they theorized that it was made new for the burial. They also found two golden Merovingian coins that were placed in the hands of the deceased, and he would have been laid out just about where the excavator is in the picture there, in the photo on the left. What makes the discovery special are the unique items that they found no other place in England so far. They found two gold foil, that very thinly pounded gold foil crosses that were probably originally placed over the deceased's eyes. And the only other place they've seen those are in burials in the Alpine regions of Europe, the Alpine regions. The other unique finds, they found an iron folding stool, folded iron stool. So it's the only one of its kind in Anglo-Saxon England. You see it there, that's that clump on the left. And they found this flagon, this jug made of copper alloy with a beautiful handle, and the chain which attaches the lid to the handle still intact. That way you don't lose your lid, right? This was most likely made in Syria and traded along trading paths all the way up to England. So it's certainly a princely burial, but who is it? Scholars differ somewhat on the dates, and so the possibility of the identity of the deceased is somewhat hypothetical. The museum handling the excavation puts the dates at between 580 and 605, and will only say that they're quite sure he's the earliest Christian Anglo-Saxon royal burial they've come across in England so far. Even more recently, in 2009, a metal detectorist found an amazing hoard of gold and silver objects in a field close to the old Roman road, Watling Street in Staffordshire. The hoard wasn't found within a mound or a burial chamber like Sutton Hoo or Prittlewell, but instead it had maybe once been a bag of cloth or in a bag of leather and had been buried by someone who hoped to return for it. The objects in the hoard date from about 670 to the year 700. You can see from this photo, it's just a few inches under the surface of the ground. That's crazy. It's a most unusual, unbalanced find. It's thrilling, but it's challenging. There are more than 3,500 objects that have been recovered, totaling nearly, among other things, 11 pounds of gold, along with many objects of silver as well. As the catalog to the Staffordshire Hoard states, this is by far the largest quantity of Anglo-Saxon gold objects ever found in one spot. And if you're asking yourself, how does the gold in this compare to the gold of Mound 1 from Sutton Hoo? That beautiful gold that we just looked at totals less than 4 pounds, and Staffordshire is nearly 11 pounds. The hoard consists mainly, and this is why it's so confusing, of pieces of military equipment, sword fittings, pommels, pyramid-shaped straps like at Sutton Hoo, buttons, things like that, but no iron sword blades, for instance, no whole weapons. Here is a helmet that's been reconstructed, the pieces of which were found in the hoard. And there's the actual cheek piece that you see on the right. And with the detail, you can see the animal interlacing. I mean, like salamanders, lizards, dragon-y kind of creatures that are all woven in among one another. There's this lovely piece. This is kind of a before and after cleaning photo for you. It's a gold garnet ornament with a mosaic of glass in the middle. This whole thing is no bigger than the top of your thumb. And there it shows what it comes out of the ground looking on the left and how beautifully cleaned it is on the right. Here's another lovely piece, a gold pendant with a garnet several inches long, broken in probably before it was buried. Okay, not during excavation, but before it was buried. And I just have it here to show you how that beautiful spiral filigree design of the cross is something that is strong throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. Here is a limestone font, miles and miles, but not too far away, in a church 150 years later, but featuring that same terrific spiral design. So the big question is, why was this hoard collected? Were they the spoils of war? Were they gathered to give an offering to the gods? Are they weapons going to be melted down for something new? We don't know. They've estimated that the value of the gold alone was worth about 1,000 head of cattle. So it was quite the find and quite the hoard. And interestingly enough, archaeologists did what you should do. They began to ask the locals, hey, have you seen any more lumps in the fields? Do you remember seeing a lump in this field years ago? And old folks said, well, yeah, they used to see one there, but it had been plowed flat. So I've put a red circle or oval around where the found was made. It's still at the crossing of two busy roads. So the hope is that maybe there's more to find in the area of the Staffordshire Hoard. Now we're going to spend our last few minutes looking at the powerful Anglo-Saxon women. Historians know the names of the wives and many of the Anglo-Saxon kings, and they were called queens, but they rarely ruled on their own. Sometimes they ruled for a while in the event of a husband's death or as a regent for their young son. But one woman did rule on her own. King Alfred the Great's daughter, Ethelfled, succeeded her husband after her husband's death as the leader of the kingdom of Mercia. Now, Mercia, if I could flash back to all of those slides I would show you, was a huge kingdom in the middle of England. She took over, and Ethelred launched victorious battles against the Vikings, regaining much of the land that had been lost by her husband. She then was succeeded by her daughter, for a few years anyway, until the daughter's uncle deposed her. Recently, one author wrote rather cheekily, he said, "How does a ruler defeat bloodthirsty invaders, secure a kingdom, and lay the foundations for England, and then almost get written out of history?" His answer was, "Be a woman, that's how." Well, all kidding aside, now more than 1100 years after Ethelfled's death, she, Lady of the Mercians, warrior queen, is emerging from the shadows into our modern world. Women were often the owners of some of the fabulous jewels that we've been looking at. This is the Kingston brooch. It's from about the year 600. It was made up of about 830 separate pieces, and it's large. It's more than 3 inches wide, made of gold, garnet, blue glass, and shell. It's the largest and finest brooch of its kind that's been found to date. It was found down in Kent, in the southern part of England, in the 19th century, buried with a woman. And this, I find, is important. The archaeologists and even people who study it now can tell that not only was it buried, but it was worn, it was loved, it was used, and it was even repaired in antiquity. So it was a much treasured piece. And here we're going to have a look at a woman we should know more about. This is Queen Emma, our Anglo-Saxon queen. She was the wife of 2 kings in succession, one English and then one Danish. And she was the mother of 2 kings, one Danish and one English. Here she is pictured at the frontispiece of a manuscript which she commissioned. And it's a poem praising herself, but also the reign of her husband, King Knut. Women were often the agents of change during this period, especially when it came to converting people to Christianity and to running huge houses of abbots and monks and nuns. One powerful abbess named Hilda was running things at the Abbey of Whitby in the north of England in the late 500s, and was on first-hand basis with Pope Gregory the Great in Rome. That's really saying something. So I'm going to sum up this way. We'll end this way. One researcher of Anglo-Saxon art says this: "Those who wish for certainty in history and who like to feel the ground firmly under their feet are best advised to study some other period besides Anglo-Saxon history." The Anglo-Saxon centuries of England's history show us evidence of artistic achievement. A rich warrior aristocracy is described in Beowulf. Scholars and the public are broadening their views of this period, which I said was formerly called the Dark Ages. I think we can stop doing that now. The excavation at Sutton Hoo and more recent discoveries bring to light considerable achievements: the establishment of royalty, the development of the Old English language, creation of glittering objects of gold and garnet, the emergence of powerful leaders who united the country and powerful women with them, all contributing to the England we know today. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
So Mary, a wonderful job as always. Folks, we'll take roughly 10 minutes of questions. If you have any questions for Mary, please type them into the Q&A. If you have any comments for Mary, please type them into the chat. And I apologize for any background noise. There's a conversation going on right before.
It can't beat the background noise of my dog. Thank you. I apologize.
No, it happens. Don't worry about it. So Marion asks, what was the name of the TV show that does digs? And is it available in the US?
Yes, it's called Time Team. And you can find it on YouTube. If you just go to YouTube, Time Team, they even have their own YouTube channel. It's been going on for decades in England. And they have relaunched it recently, and you can see it online, and you can join and be a Patreon member if you want to as well. The construct is a little artificial in that they learn about a place and they go and they give themselves 3 days to dig. Now, having said that, these are very professional digs, and the reality is that their digs do continue well after the sort of televised portion of the show. So it is a show for entertainment, but it is a legitimate archaeological dig, and they are legitimate professional archaeologists and scholars. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It really began with decades ago with people writing in and going, hey, I have some funny lumps and bumps in my field, and I wonder if you could come and excavate them. And so it's called Time Team. And I do encourage you to enjoy it. You'll spend many hours enjoying it, I hope.
Joan also recommends the Detectorists.
Yes.
Detectorists. She says it's a great show.
Yeah.
Joan asks, where did all the gold come from?
Oh, that's a good question. Where did all the gold come from? Well, it could have come from Wales. There are large gold mines. There were large gold mines in Wales. It could also have been traded up through trade routes from far away. But it's completely possible that they could have been using gold found right there in the British Isles.
Nancy also recommends a Netflix show called The Dig.
Yes, that's it. The Dig is the film made after the book, which was recently written. So I would definitely recommend The Dig. The film is quite authentic, really. I mean, of course, they have to cut a few corners, but it tells the wonderful story of Basil Brown, whose name had been lost until the book came out, and brought him to light, and how instrumental he was in and professional he was at doing the first 2 years of Sutton Hoo dig for Mrs. Pretty. And she was a real person named Mrs. Pretty. But yes, it's a fascinating film. And the book was written, I understand it, by the nephew of, if you've seen the film and the young archaeologists to come, one is featured a young woman. Her nephew is the man who wrote the book. So real people writing real history.
Let's see here. Joyce says, wonderful and informative presentation. Francis says, thank you. Marge says, I studied Celtic and Anglo-Saxon archaeology under James Graham Campbell at University College London in 77-78. And I remember how excited I was to be introduced to the fabulous finds at Sutton Hoo.
Oh, that's fabulous. I'm so jealous. I have to admit that on a personal note, that purse lid, the white and golden enamel and garnet piece, that piece was the one that struck me first as a young freshman in college, flipping through an art history book and not really knowing what I was going to do. I saw that and couldn't take my eyes off of it. So.
See here, Margaret recommends Digging for Britain, which is a DVD series.
Oh, brilliant show. Yes, very good. I'm glad everybody get that one. Digging for Britain. Yeah, brilliant.
Diane says thank you. Mary says, so wonderful. I've really enjoyed today's presentation. Sally said, wonderful presentation, enriches my knowledge of East Anglia, where many of my ancestors are from.
Oh, good. Oh, great. Oh, it's really, that's wonderful. And I mean, I got the impression they can't turn over a stone over there without finding something wonderful. So let's hope they continue. Yeah.
Anne says, I spent so long looking at a gorgeous piece from Sutton Hoo at the British Museum that a suspicious guard came to talk with me.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, no, I mean, my nose prints are all over those cases. I agree.
Nancy says, maybe I missed it, but were these ships buried on purpose, or
Yes.
were they sunk?
Oh yeah, no, they're buried on purpose. They were real ships.
Yeah.
And they were, let me see how far I can go back before I can find the aerial view. Sorry for the whiplash here. Well, there's a drawing, and this isn't too far off. You see the little river in the back. There really was a river nearby. And so these were real ships, which they dragged from the river up the hill to then bury and then cover over with the earthen mounds. And so if you pardon the whiplash again for a little bit longer, let's go back all the way. Oh, you're going to be ill, but there we go. So there look like there are trees in the way right now. Don't worry about that. 1500 years ago, there might not have been trees there. But you can see the little estuary, and you can see the white blobs in the middle of the screen are tents for the archaeologists, and the brown are the mounds. And so real ships were brought up. This was we're more used to this tradition maybe with the Vikings. When we think about ship burials and the Vikings, they put the dead person on the ship, they float it out into the water, light it on fire, they go to Valhalla, yay. But the Vikings and Scandinavians also practiced ship burial. There are not very many of them there either. And as of right now, the two at Sutton Hoo and a third one about just a few miles up at a village called Snape are the only ones they have found so far in England. But they were real ships that they used to send these kings off to their afterlife. And again, Redwall was a pagan, died a pagan, so he was headed to the afterlife with a big ship.
Philomena asks, how were they able to create colored glass? What did they use for the dye? I'm amazed how intricate some of these pieces are and how detailed. Wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you. Well, even, there are different types of ash and different types of minerals that can go in to make colored glass. And it wasn't a new, I know, see there again, people thought, oh, this is the Dark Ages. They're a bunch of barbarians. They don't know how to do anything. Well, that's not true. They hadn't forgotten all of the lessons of, say, the Romans who had been there. The Romans had been making colored glass for 1,000 years, almost at that point. And so they just did. Ancient people knew how to do these things. And so it was a knowledge that they had not completely lost. And yet that's how the Dark Ages have been painted, mostly by the Victorians, I think. Thanks a lot. That there were just that all knowledge of the ancient world had been completely lost, and that just obviously, as you just point out, wasn't true.
All right, so we'll take about 5 more minutes of questions. Nancy asks, can you visit the Sutton Hoo location and see anything?
Good question, because those are 2 important questions, and they're different, aren't they? They're separate. You can visit the site, but you won't see any objects like that. Those objects, those magnificent things, are at the British Museum in London. But you can visit the site. I think it's a National Trust site. And so they have put a big interpretive center there. And I don't think they let you walk around up and down the mounds. They have reburied or covered back up the mounds. And so I don't know if they fixed the trenches there, but they have, I don't think they let people access the mounds, like go have a picnic on top of Mound 1. Don't think you can do that. But they have, they rebuilt some of them to their, what they assume was their original height. And again, whiplash. But the point being that if we think away the trees, some of those, the idea is some of those original mounds may have been tall enough to see from the water, and that would be like a super impressive thing. So yes and no. yes, you can go to the site and you can explore and have a fabulous visit to the museum, which I would love to do sometime, the interpretive center there. But the objects themselves, you have to go to London for. Thank you.
Barbara says, thank you for a great talk. I have seen the Sutton Hoo and some other treasures from this period at the British Museum. Have any digs found artifacts of ordinary people's burials, or would those objects have disintegrated over time?
Oh, good question. That's a great question. So yes, I'm sure that they have. Typically, though, during the pre-Christian time, the Anglo-Saxons were pagan. There was cremation was their typical form of burial. So that doesn't leave us much. And grave goods often go with that. Christian burials, you might find a thing or two. Here's what usually stymies, and this is true for archaeology of other periods as well, what sort of skews our view of what's found. A poor person or a normal person will have a comb of wood, okay, little wooden comb if they're lucky, you know, pick the nits out, that kind of thing, little wooden comb. A rich person has a comb made of ivory or a comb made with ivory and gold and garnet. So of the two that are going to remain viable after 1,500 years in the soil, it isn't going to be the wooden comb. It's going to be the ivory one or the gold one. And so we get askew. So archaeologists don't find the cheaper things, the wooden things. They just don't find those. They don't find the normal people's things as surviving as well because they're buried in the ground. And so it skews all archaeologists' views. So it's something that they all keep in mind, I think, when they're assessing a culture, is that it looks like, woo, everybody was rich and all wore beautiful ivory combs and used combs. No, we don't often have the normal population's things to tell us their story.
So folks, as we start to wind down, let Mary know in the chat if you enjoyed this morning's presentation. Alice says, it's so amazing that they could make such beautiful jewelry so long ago. Yes. Frank says, bravo, great presentation for us fans of Sutton Hoo. Also recommends the dig, amazing finds. Nancy
thank you so
says,
much.
Nancy says, thank you for an excellent presentation. Kathy says, so fascinating. Thanks so much for a delightful presentation. Philomena says, so wonderful. Joan says, I loved it. Marion says, awesome presentation.
Wow,
Dory
you
says,
guys.
it was fabulous. Marge says, it was wonderful. What a treat. Nancy says, this makes me want to get a ticket to London to see the museum. And Sally says, exceptional presentation.
Wow.
And the comments and compliments keep coming in here. So Mary, I think we're going to wrap it there.
Yes, sir.
I do want folks to know we're going to see Mary. So on good news and bad news. Bad news is we're not going to see Mary in November, but we're going to see her on Thursday, December 1st, the first day of December at 11 o'clock for the history of the Nutcracker. So
you bet.
Really looking forward to that one, Mary. Mary, any last words before we wrap it up?
No, thank you very much. And I love all your comments and your suggestions for other viewing. Be busy, have fun. Thank you so much. Thanks, Robert.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Look for an email later today with the feedback survey, with the resource handout, with the recording and information about some other upcoming art history presentations, as well as the Reading Rivals information. So thank you all so much, and everyone have a great day.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.